Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever plan to do something only to forget it completely, and then almost convince yourself you actually did it? Like that time you were sure you remembered to buy milk, but then realized you didn't. Well, today we're diving into some fascinating new research that explores exactly how our minds play tricks on us when we plan actions. This study asks a really interesting question. Can the act of planning, of thinking about different ways to do something, actually mess with our memories later on? Make us remember doing things we only considered doing but never actually did. It's like when you're deciding what route to take to work and you think about a couple of options. What happens to the memory of those other options? So the scientists in this study were curious about how our brains handle all these potential actions. When we plan, our brain doesn't just pick one path, it considers many. Think of it like having a bunch of different routes on a map, and you have to pick the best one. The key idea here is that all those other routes, the ones you don't pick, they're still represented in your mind somehow. And the researchers wondered if these unchosen plans could sneak into our memories and make us think we actually did them. They point out that brain studies show that even before we decide on an action, our brains are actively working with multiple possibilities. It is like a little mental rehearsal of different scenarios. And if these plans are stored in our memory, they could potentially be mistaken for real memories of actions we've completed. This sets up a key question. How does our memory tell the difference between what we actually did and what we just thought about doing? Usually when we actually do something, we get all sorts of sensory feedback, right? We see it, we feel it, we hear it. This helps our brain tag it as a real action. But the researchers mentioned that sometimes just imagining doing something can make us feel more confident that we actually did it. This is called imagination inflation. And they've also seen that watching someone else do something can make us remember doing it ourselves, which is pretty wild. So with all this in mind, they designed a couple of clever experiments to see if planning itself could create these false memories. They wanted to know if the memories we form are more about what we actually did, or if they're also influenced by the planning process that happened before we acted. Here is how they did it in a nutshell. Imagine playing a video game where you have to navigate a maze. In this study, participants were shown a maze with several paths leading from a start point to an end point. They had about 10 seconds to look at all the paths and decide which one was the shortest. This was the planning phase. They were told to find the shortest route. Now, here is the really interesting part. After they planned their shortest route, they were supposed to actually navigate the maze. But on some of these trials, one of the paths they could have taken would suddenly get a block, like a wall, dropped on it after they had already planned their route. This forced them to rethink their plan if the blocked path was the one they intended to take. Later on, after playing for a bit, they were tested on their memory. They'd be shown the same mazes. But this time, the game would stop at different points along a path. The participants had to say whether they had been at that exact spot during their actual navigation. The probes, these test points, could be on the path they actually took, on a different path they could have taken but didn't, or on a path that had been blocked. The big comparison was between how often people falsely remembered being on a path that was planned, but then blocked versus a path that was planned but still available, but simply not chosen. They were essentially asking, were people more likely to falsely remember a path if it was planned but then taken away from them, compared to a path they just decided not to use for other reasons? And they found something really significant. People were more likely to falsely claim they had traveled on a path that had been blocked later on, compared to paths they had simply chosen not to take. This suggests that the act of planning a path, even if it's then rendered impossible, leaves a stronger memory trace than simply considering a path and then ignoring it. But it gets even more interesting. This effect was strongest when the blocked path was the shortest one. The one they were most actively trying to take. This implies that the more deeply a route was incorporated into their immediate action plan, the more likely it was to cause a false memory if it was later removed. It's like the brain put more effort into that shortest path, and that effort, even though the path wasn't ultimately taken, created a stronger, albeit sometimes false, memory. Now, a good research team always asks, could there be another explanation? One possibility was that maybe it wasn't the planning itself, but just the visual presence of the block. Maybe seeing a block on a path just made people pay more attention to that path, making it seem more familiar later, regardless of whether it was a planned route or just a dead end. So for their second experiment, they added a clever twist. They still had mazes with multiple paths, but now some of these paths were actual dead-end paths that you wouldn't even consider as a viable route from the start. They could then block either a viable route or a dead-end path. And the results were clear. Participants still showed higher false memories for viable routes that were planned, but then blocked compared to paths that were never viable in the first place, like dead ends, even if those dead ends were also blocked. This is crucial. It tells us that it's not just about seeing the block, but about whether that path was actively a part of your planning process. This strongly supports the idea that the act of planning, of mentally rehearsing that shortest or most optimal path, creates a memory trace. When that path is later blocked, it can lead to a false memory, as if you did take it. It's like your brain tagged that planned route with a higher importance, and that tag stuck around, influencing your later memory. So what does it all mean? This research suggests that our memories aren't just passive recordings of what we've read. They are actively shaped by our intentions and our plans. The more effort we put into planning a particular action, the stronger its mnemonic trace, even if we never actually perform it. And this trace can sometimes lead us to misremember having done that action. It's like our brains are trying to be efficient. When you seriously consider a plan, especially an optimal one, your brain invests in representing it. This representation then becomes part of your memory landscape. If that plan is thwarted, the memory representation might still be strong enough to cause a familiar feeling when you encounter it later, fooling you into thinking you completed it. This is a really important finding because it bridges the gap between prospective cognition, like planning for the future, and retrospective cognition, like remembering the past. They're not as separate as we might think. The processes that help us choose actions also help create the subtle distortions in our memories. Now, the researchers are also wise enough to acknowledge that there could be other explanations. They mentioned that during the memory test, the blocked paths were actually visible again, without the block. So it's possible that when asked to remember, participants might have reconstructed what they would have done. And since the shortest path was the most logical choice, they might have just inferred that they must have taken it. Regardless of the block, this is called retrospective reconstruction. They suggest future research could explore this further by perhaps showing the block again during the memory test to see if that changes the outcome. It's good scientific practice to consider these alternative explanations. Overall, this study gives us a fascinating peek into how our minds work. It shows that when we plan, we're not just selecting an action, we're actively creating nuanced mental representations. And these representations can indeed influence our memories in surprisingly complex ways, sometimes leading us to believe we have done things that were only ever in our minds. It really highlights that what we remember doing is influenced not just by what we actually did, but by all the paths we considered taking. So, next time you have that uncanny feeling you've done something you're not sure you ever did, remember this research. It might not be a faulty memory, but a byproduct of your brain's incredible planning abilities. What do you think about these findings? Do you ever have these kinds of memory blips? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into the mind, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science breakdowns, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next exploration. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.